There's a famous narrative from the life of Jesus, and we talked about this about 5 years ago, if you were around then. And every time I read this narrative, honestly, it kind of feels like the gratitude bar gets raised a little bit. I immediately think about the people I'm grateful for in my heart that haven't heard it from my lips or my pen. Now, Luke, who thoroughly investigated everything in the life of Jesus, begins this narrative like this. He says, "Now Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and he traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee." And if we had a map, I would show you this area. This is a very remote area, sparsely populated. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And as he was going, the text says, and as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. People with leprosy, they basically hovered between life and death. They weren't dead, but they couldn't really live. And worse than that, imagine, they stood at a distance and they watched everybody else live their lives. As you know, in ancient times, leprosy was considered highly contagious. People afflicted with leprosy don't experience pain the way the rest of us do. And in a culture, this is the part we can't really understand sometimes, in a culture that required physical labor just to survive, this often resulted in injuries that either went unnoticed or unattended to. So their bodies would visibly deteriorate over time. And the law actually required somebody who had leprosy to live on the outskirts of town in a designated area. And anytime they came toward town or came toward civilization, they had to warn people that they were approaching. Consequently, lepers often created their own communities. They grew their own crops and they survived the best that they could. And it would come as no surprise to Luke's first century readers that a community of lepers were kind of eking out a living in this remote borderland between the predominantly Jewish territory of Galilee and the area inhabited mostly by Samaritans. Now, this has nothing to do with the story, but I think it's worth pointing out. At the end of this account, we discovered that this particular community of lepers was comprised of both Jews and Samaritans, two groups who normally would have nothing to do with each other for both political and religious reasons. But here's the thing: pain, suffering, and alienation. Pain, suffering, and alienation have a way of minimizing differences and maximizing what people have in common. When people need each other, politics and religion, they are just not front burner issues. Just a thought. Anyway, Luke continues. He goes on and he says this: "These lepers, the 10 lepers, they stood at a distance with their faces covered," because they had to cover their faces, which sounds familiar, right? "They stood at a distance with their faces covered, and they called out in a loud voice from a distance, 'Jesus, Master, have pity on us.'" I mean, they're basically out in the middle of nowhere. He's in this little tiny village. They have apparently come into the edge of the village to get supplies. They recognize it's Jesus. They knew him by his reputation, and they call out Master, which was really unusual because this was a term pretty much reserved for those who were continuous followers of Jesus, his disciples, and clearly they were not. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and if he could do what people said he could do, he was their only hope. And the text says, Luke says, that when Jesus saw them, he shouted out, he shouted back to them, "Go, go," which was not really what they were expecting. I mean, that's what they'd heard for years. Go as in go away. But here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests," which they must have thought, go and show them what? There's nothing to show, and besides, the priests aren't all that anxious to see us. In fact, nobody is. But Jesus had a triple intent here. According to the law, anyone with any kind of skin disease after being quarantined had to go to a local priest to be given the all clear before they could go back into society. The implication was by the time you get there, when Jesus said go, the implication was Jesus was saying, by the time you get there when you go, when you see the priest, you're going to get the all clear. But there was even more to it than that. Imagine this. When 10 healed lepers show up, the priest would certainly ask how all 10 of them were healed, and that would be an unprecedented event, and it would clearly be a miracle, which again would add to Jesus' reputation. It would be impossible to argue that something extraordinary hadn't happened. And here's the third thing. Their willingness to go before anything had changed would certainly be an expression of extraordinary faith in Jesus. And if nothing changed on the way, it would make fools of the lepers. So there was a lot at stake, and there was a lot behind this request to go. So if you're in their situation, what do you do in a situation like that? It reminds me of the advice that my great-grandfather gave my father when my father was a teenager. He said this. He said, "Grandson, if God tells you to run your head through a brick wall, start running and trust God to make a hole." So Jesus said, go, and they went, and not because it made any sense, but because Jesus told them to go. And you probably remember what happened next. And as they went, as they obeyed, as they went, they were cleansed. They literally walked by faith. This is a phrase we throw around a lot in the church and in Christianity, to walk by faith. This is literally what it means to walk by faith. They responded to the promise and the prompting of Jesus before they knew the outcome. That's what it means to walk by faith. But then the twist in the story, and the reason we're even talking about this, one of these lepers, when he saw he was healed, he turned around and he came back. He turned around, he returned, he completed the loop, he filled the gap. He came back, the text says, praising God in a loud voice, and he literally threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. No more social distancing. He walked right up to Jesus and fell at his feet. He was not content. He was not content to feel grateful. He demonstrated it. He expressed it. And think about it, as much as he was ready to get back to living among the living, as much as he wanted to put all of this behind him, he knew he had to close the gratitude loop. After all, Jesus had just given him his life back. So he did what we all need to do. He went back to thank the one who had enabled him to move forward. He went back to thank the one who enabled him to move forward with his life. And Luke, looking back over the story arc of Jesus' life, I think he must have smiled when he penned these next 4 words in Greek, 5 words in English. And he, talking about the leper, and he was a Samaritan. The implication being the other 9 probably weren't. This man had experienced alienation and discrimination on multiple levels. He was extra grateful. And I think the reason for this added, seemingly unimportant detail comes to light when you read the entirety of Luke's gospel. Because over and over in his gospel, Luke highlights Jesus' encounters with outsiders, people that his first century audience would never expect Jesus to have anything to do with. And over, it was the outsiders who expressed the most gratitude. They were not confused about how undeserving they were. Their pride and their busyness did not get in the way of their effort to close the gratitude loop, especially with Jesus. But this incident doesn't end there. Jesus asked a question. He said, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Now, in the Greek text, it's interesting because the interrogative where is actually at the end of the sentence for emphasis. Here's how it reads in the Greek. Literally, the 9, where? The 9, where are they? And of course, Jesus isn't really expecting an answer. He's just making a stinging observation. Something is missing. Someone is missing. Someones are missing. The other 9 have missed the moment. The other 9 have missed their opportunity. Something was missing, incomplete, unfinished, open-ended. The circle isn't closed. But now the window to close it has closed. Now, if you're a parent, you understand what Jesus is getting at here. And for those of us who can remember how our parents raised us, we understand what Jesus is getting at too. When you were a kid and somebody gave you a gift and one of your parents was standing there, they would immediately say what? They would say thank you, as in, right now, say thank you. There was urgency, like quick, say thank you right now. Time is running out. Close the circle, connect the dots. And this is Jesus' point. The other 9 missed the moment, and the moment had passed. How ungrateful. Their entire destiny had been changed. Apart from Jesus, apart from his intervention, they're going to spend the rest of their lives eking out a living in the middle of nowhere. They've been restored to their families and their children. They could work again. They could worship again. And where are they? And when we read this story, isn't it true we respond the same way Jesus did? Yeah, where are those guys? But before we judge too harshly, I imagine if someone had confronted the other 9 about their apparent lack of gratitude, I should say, I imagine that they would have been quick to respond with like, what? We're not ungrateful. We are so grateful. Our hearts are filled with gratitude. I mean, the other 9 had to have felt it, right? But the problem is, like us sometimes, they didn't express it. And Jesus, like us, was baffled. And he asked, has no one returned? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Only one returner? And again, the question is a rebuke. And it also implies that the other lepers may have been Galileans like Jesus rather than Samaritans. Then he turns back to the one who returned and he says once again, rise and go. And of course, this is the second time he's told him to go, but this time there would be no reason for him to return. The circle was complete. And then this final statement, your faith has made you well. Unexpressed gratitude may indicate an inflated view of self. And here's why I say that. The message of ingratitude is this: I could have done this without you, so I don't really owe you anything. Isn't it true that arrogance and ingratitude are generally found under the same rock? I mean, arrogant people are generally ungrateful people, and ungrateful people usually come across as arrogant. So I want you to be really honest for just a moment. Is expressing your gratitude difficult for you? Is expressing gratitude difficult for you? Are you more comfortable pointing out how something could have been better rather than recognizing how good it actually is? If so, have you ever done any work digging around trying to figure out why you're kind of wired that way? If not, I'll give you a starting point. Here's a hint. Gratitude feels like an admission of weakness. I mean, it makes you feel like you may not have been able to accomplish what you've accomplished without help. Guess what? You couldn't. In the wake of your progress, in the wake of your success, in your rear view mirror, professionally, academically, financially, relationally, athletically, are dozens of people who facilitated your progress, who facilitated your success. And acknowledging their role is not weakness, it's maturity. It's evidence you've let go of an inflated, unhealthy sense of independence. Gratitude is evidence that you have life in proper perspective. You would not be where you are without the support and the help of other people. You do actually owe them a debt of gratitude, and that's okay. So, back to Luke's account for just a moment. Let's be the one. Let's be the one rather than the 9. Let's decide, let's make up our mind to be like the one who went back to thank the one who enabled him to move forward. Why not make it a habit of our lives to go back to the people who've allowed us to move forward? So here's the question. Who helped you move forward? Who helps you move forward? Have you thanked them recently? I mean, sure you pay them. I'm sure they married you. I'm sure it's your mom, right? But have you expressed your gratitude lately? You may feel it when you think about it, but have you expressed it? And if not, why not? Could it be you are in fact more like the 9 than the 1? That you took what was given, you got distracted by the new opportunity, the new freedom, the new recognition, and then you just went on your merry way without circling back to say thank you? I mean, if somebody told your story, or when somebody tells your story, will you be the story of the 1 or the story of the 9? And here's some good news. You get to decide. But you decide that story one expression of gratitude at a time. Gratitude that we feel but don't express is simply ingratitude by another name. So let's close the loop, right? Let's get in the habit of circling back. Let's be returners. Let's decide today to be the one.